I'm Reverend Roger Birchhausen. I'm Executive Director of the UU Partner Church Council, and I'm delighted to have you here. It's really exciting to be at the opening of a year-long celebration of the proclamation of the Edict of Torda. The actual anniversary of the adoption took place this past Friday, and as we'll see, this is the Edict of Torda was such an important part of our UU heritage, and we think it still speaks profoundly to us today. Not to give it a sort of a godlike status, but God and the UCC campaign still speaking. I feel like the Edict of Torda is still speaking and really has something to say to us as Unitarian Universalists around the world. And so we figured out, we think this needs a whole year, not just a day or a weekend of celebration. So the UU International Joint Working Group, which is Eric Cherry and Sarah Asher and myself, and the other two will introduce themselves in a bit, in collaboration with our organizations and the Hungarian Unitarian Church and others, have created a year-long celebration. And it's good to note that generous funding from the UU Funding Panel and the Hibbert Trust in the UK are supporting the activities this year. So to begin with, and we welcome more people to this, we're really glad to have you all here. To begin with, want to focus on the three areas that we'll be talking about, or that we'll pay attention to during this year. The first area is worship, and we have this past weekend, a lot of congregations around the world have celebrated the Edict of Torda. I think others will be doing it this weekend and even in the coming weeks. The second area of celebration this year is theological reflection, and we'll be talking a lot about that tonight. Before getting to that, though, I want to lift up the third area of celebration, which is travel and pilgrimage. And you can find details about some public pilgrimage offerings at Torda450.org. So we'll be referring to that website quite a bit tonight and in the coming year. That's the place to go for information on the Edict of Torda. So I'm going to jump in a sec and talk about a little more about the theological reflection that's going to be a centerpiece now of the year. We're going to focus this around an international panel of UU theologians, and I'm delighted that I think three of the five are with us on this call. That's awesome. And we also will have reflection modules for small groups and individuals, as well as a mid-year and an end-year webinar. And the reflection modules are really going to be wonderful materials to use, and the January one is actually already available. Let me show you, by sharing my screen, who is on the theologians panel. So I'm on the Torda450 website, which looks like this. And as we scroll down on the theological tab of it, we get to the panel. And one of our panelists is Rupaya Lamar, who is on this call and is from Northeast India. A second panelist is Reverend Fulgence Anagajamana, who is Burundian, living in Canada. Ellen Nagoho is on the call and is our third panelist from Indonesia. Dr. Stephanie Mitchum is the fourth panelist, and she is from the United States and is also on this call. And then Reverend Norbert Rox is the fifth panelist from Transylvania. And if you scroll to the top of this same page, there's a schedule of activities for the year. And so we are right here in the first part, the initial webinar. And I'm just going to run through this for a brief minute. The February dialogue will be on theology and UU identity. It will be the panel of five theologians. Mostly, we think, together. There may be one visa issue that gets in the way, but at least four will be together at the International Conference of Unitarians and Universalists gathering council meeting and conference in Kathmandu. And so we have the time and the date, and if you are lucky enough to have planned to go to Kathmandu, we'll see you there. You can be part of this in person. Otherwise, there'll be a way, we hope, to be able to join electronically. And then finally, there'll be an archive version for folks to see it there, when it works for them. And so that'll get us kicked off. Then in March, we will have a small group reflection module based on the conversation in February, available by March 1 for small groups, ministry groups and congregations and individuals. In April, the panel will again mostly be in person, and they'll be speaking at the UU United Nations office seminar in New York City. And their topic will be freedom and resistance. The May reflection module will focus on their conversation and help people go deeper into that area. In June, we'll have a webinar to review the dialogue so far and where we're going. We also will have some of the panel at General Assembly, both for ministry days ahead of General Assembly and General Assembly itself. Then we will go on to July, where the panel will be in person in Koleshvar in Transylvania, and there they'll address the issue of religious freedom in the era of rising intolerance. At this point, I need to confess that my mouse battery has died, which means that you are all stuck on the screen. Oh, there. Let's see, it's moving a little bit. So we'll see if I can get through this before I lose it again. In August, there'll be a reflection on the July conversation about religious freedom in the era of rising intolerance. In September, there'll be, the panel will meet this time online, and that will focus on the role of classical traditional Unitarianism in the 21st century, so beginning to look forward. The October module will focus on that conversation. In November, in a place to be announced, but most likely online, the panel will discuss the challenges of universality and multiple spiritual identities. The December reflection will focus on that, and then in January, we'll have a closing webinar. I'm going to stop my share so we get out of here before my battery dies. All right. So we hope that you'll be willing and able to participate in a whole bunch of those activities. I think the whole arc of the year conversation is going to be amazing and impactful for our global faith. So with that, just to remind folks, Eric in the introduction said we will have time for conversation after we talk at you for quite a while. So we'll get to that. What we're going to do now is go into some of the history and the context and the relevance of the Edict of Torda, which sets the stage for this theological exploration that we're going to do together during this year. So I'm going to review some of the events that paved the way before turning it over to Sarah to talk about the edict itself and to share some of the words from it. So I could do many hours of many of the events that led to the Edict of Torda, but we'll just hit a few highlights here. A great place to start is 325, when the Council of Nicaea met, and the Arian controversy that was a key part of the Council of Nicaea. So Arius was a Christian leader who lived in Egypt, and the controversy was about the nature of Jesus. So Arius argued that Jesus is derived from God, therefore is finite and inferior to God. And on the other side of the equation, there were the Trinitarians who believed in this unity, this triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Roman emperor at the time, Constantine, who was the one that made the Roman state Christian, called a council to resolve the controversy. And in the course of that council, the Trinitarians won. Arius was deposed and exiled. Arianism persisted, now as a heresy, but it did persist. It creeped up here and there, and usually as heresies was put down. But it began to burst into the daylight again in the middle 1500s in several places in the Reformation era Europe. And so we jump ahead many years to 1540. John Zapolya is the ruler of Transylvania, which is a Hungarian principality. And he died in 1540, leaving his wife, Queen Isabella, and his infant son, John Sigismund, as rulers of that principality. So Queen Isabella ruled as a regent for her son, John Sigismund. And during those years, they were a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. And it's really during Isabella's regency that some of the seeds were planted that resulted in the Edict of Torda during her son's reign. In 1553, so meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, Michael Servetus was executed in John Calvin's Geneva for his anti-Trinitarian heresy. So Servetus was born in Spain, lived much of his life in France, where as a young man he published The Heretical on the Errors of the Trinity. To avoid persecution from the Inquisition, he assumed a phony name and identity, became a well-known doctor in France, published a book later called The Restoration of Christianity, which again attacked the idea of the Trinity and also the Calvinist idea of predestination. And that's the book where he also threw in some revolutionary ideas about the pulmonary system. And eventually he fled to Geneva, which was a curious choice because he and John Calvin had been long acquainted but were somewhat bitter enemies. And in Geneva, Servetus was imprisoned, tried, and executed for his faith, and almost all the copies of his books burned. So that's 1553. In 1559, John Sigismund, now of age, becomes the ruler of Transylvania following the death of his mother. Jumping ahead to 1563, Giorgio Biandrata moves to Transylvania and becomes the court physician for John Sigismund. And Biandrata was an Italian. He came to Transylvania at the age of 48 by way of Geneva, where he encountered Servetus and Calvin, and also by way of Poland. And he was an ardent anti-Trinitarian and had great influence on the court. In 1567, David Ferens comes into the story, convinces John Sigismund to accept Unitarianism. David was born a Catholic, became a Lutheran, became a Calvinist and Reformed bishop, then became a Unitarian and founded the Unitarian Church in Transylvania. And he believed that God is one and indivisible, so rejected the Trinity. We can see that the roots of this really go back to Arianism 1,200 years earlier. And like Arius, he didn't see much supporting the Trinity in the New Testament. So with the ruler of Transylvania now being a Unitarian, there was a whole bunch of religious dialogue and debate culminating at the Diet of Torda, where Hungarian nobles and Sakes and Saxons in the court proclaimed freedom of religion for the Roman Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, for Calvinists and Unitarians. That was a culmination of a decade of theological dialogue. And that's the event on January 13, 1568 that we are celebrating and focusing on this year. So with that, the stage is set for that Edict of Torda, and we'll turn it over to Sarah.
And before I jump into the the text itself. I'm Reverend Sarah Asher, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists, and the person's sort of spearheading and planning the February conference in Kathmandu. So on to the text of the edict itself. I will actually read you a small portion of it, and hopefully slowly enough that you can get a sense of it. The text is actually on the Torda450 website if you want to read it more thoroughly. But because I know that several of us are actually just on a phone, so I will read you the text. And it reads, His Majesty, our Lord, in what manner he, together with his realm, legislated in the matter of religion at the previous diets, in the same manner now, in this diet, reaffirms that in every place the preachers shall preach and explain the gospel, each according to his understanding of it. And if the congregation like it, well. If not, no one shall compel them, for their souls would not be satisfied. But they shall be permitted to keep a preacher whose preaching they approve. Therefore, none of the superintendents or others shall abuse the preachers. No one shall be reviled for his religion by anyone, according to the previous statutes, and it is not permitted that anyone should threaten anyone else by imprisonment or by removal from his post for his teaching. For faith is the gift of God, and this comes from hearing, which hearing is by the word of God. So ends the official text. One of the things to note is in the edict, it actually refers to references Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 9, which actually reads, For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your doing alone, for it is a gift of God, not the result of works, so that no one may boast. And it also references Romans chapter 10, verse 7, which reads, Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. So the edict is essentially taking existing religious text already accepted as canon, but expands its meaning to actually deny the Trinity, and also to sort of say that you as a preacher and also the person sitting in the pew can actually determine for yourself your understanding of faith and your beliefs. So within the context historically, this is actually fairly radical, and the edict is in fact the very first governmentally sanctioned proclamation of religious freedom. So it's the first text anywhere in the world that says you have a right, people have a right to preach, and people have a right to believe as they deem fit and as makes sense to them. So in a religious context in which there is actually significant disagreement on what is a true faith, being able to stand up and have a governmental royal leader declare that there is no one true religious belief, that not every person needs to believe the same, is incredibly radical and actually quite threatening to the social system and the social order of the day. So this is actually, it's a pretty significant text, and we read it now in the 21st century and go, well, of course, religious freedom. But of the time, religious freedom was almost a foreign idea, no matter where it cropped up. Not just Unitarianism itself, but the concept that the people and a preacher could actually preach one thing and not the same thing, and a different preacher would preach something different, and both could actually have the potential of being true. And that the other piece of this that actually is quite radical is that the preachers actually aren't just reiterating what they were taught, but that they, through their own reason, through their own exploration and their own intellect, actually being able to come to an understanding of faith and belief within their own actions and understanding. And so there's really no part of this that isn't actually really quite sort of cutting edge in mid to late 1500s. And even though in our 21st century, where freedoms of all sorts seem quite easy for some, depending upon what country and culture you're within, we feel, and we're hoping that all of you also feel, actually, that this edict is a touchstone, is a reminder of the freedoms of our own hearts and our own souls, and that it's not just a matter of living our lives, but it's really a matter of living our faith and understanding that the freedom isn't just to believe as you wish, but to put that belief into action. Because the ability to believe and the act of faith itself is actually something that is divine in and of itself. So it's pretty significant. And so we're hoping that part of your reflections, when we have the panels and they get to have these conversations, we're hoping you take this into your congregations, into your families, into your circle of friends and colleagues, and actually begin to explore the radicalness of this statement even today, of being able to say there is not one truth. There is not one way to believe. There is not one understanding of God. And that ultimately, sort of underneath the words of this edict is this sort of idea that God itself, and I will use that modern language, itself, is actually beyond complete human understanding. And so our job is to actually do that exploring and do that investigating and talk to people and reflect ourselves on what we really do believe and how that belief gets lived. Because it's not just a matter of what you have in your head. It's, as we all know, what you believe gets lived out through how you live, you act, who you spend time with, what you spend your energy on, where you spend your money, all those sorts of places. And this edict is a reminder and a reconnecting of our religious history that says what you believe matters. And then we have the right and the responsibility to then also ensure that others have the right to believe as they choose as well. So it's not just a matter for our own individual personal belief, but it's that religious freedom is a human right. It isn't just a privilege. And that part of what our answer and what our work is in the 21st century is to maintain that right for all people. So I'll stop my preaching and hand it off to Eric.
Well, good evening, good day, everyone, and thanks to Roger and Sarah for their pieces of the presentation. I'm the director of the International Office for the Unitarian Universalist Association and a proud colleague of Sarah and Roger's in the International Joint Working Group, the UU International Joint Working Group, and I join them in feeling excited and hopeful about what the year of theological reflection can mean for Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists around the world. And what a joy it was to watch on social media the celebrations that were taking place in Transylvania over this past weekend, in Koleshvar and in Torda and in many other places. The celebrations, the presentations, the joy, the pride that were expressed were so inspirational, so heartwarming, and for me, they point to a really foundational Unitarian and now Unitarian Universalist principle of resistance to authoritarianism. Really, the Edict of Torda is one of Europe's first examples of authoritarianism being broken down, of the position, the truth, the governing point of view that one religious perspective ought not to control the religious perspectives of the people. The interesting analog to the 21st century is that much of what made that possible in the 16th century was new technology. And of course, the new technology in the 16th century that many scholars smarter than me would make the claim made the Reformation possible was the printing press. The chance for the written word, the text, to be in the hands of the people, not only the religious authorities, but anyone who had access to that technology and the education to read it. Michael Servetus would not have had his influence if not for the printing press. Suffice to say, neither would Martin Luther or John Calvin or the leaders of the Magisterial Reformation. And today, the new technology or the current technology is social media. In many ways, the printing press was the Twitter of the 16th century, and now we're trying to find ways to make use of that new technology for communication's sake, for the sake of resisting authoritarianism by virtue of religious freedom in our own time, 450 years later. So I'm going to take us back into the chronology here, sort of the events that were possible following the Edict of Torda, what it meant in other contexts, and what followed from that foundational event. And it starts with some fairly distressing news, which was that in 1571, the very young king of Transylvania, John Sigismund, died unexpectedly, unmarried and without progeny. The crown for Transylvania passed to another family, the Bathory family, that had long history in the region in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Hungary. And Stephen Bathory, when he came to power, respected the Edict of Torda in its literal meaning, which granted religious freedom to the revealed religions, including Unitarianism, and allowed for Jews, Muslims, Orthodox Christians, and others freedom to practice their religious traditions. But he made one very important new proclamation, and the new proclamation is that change had to stop here. No more change would be allowed. No innovation was what the new political and religious authorities in Transylvania required. And as you might imagine or know through the history, David Ferenc, who converted to Unitarianism, who converted cities and towns and villages throughout Transylvania to Unitarianism, who converted the king to Unitarianism, was not interested in stopping the innovation. David believed that Reformation was a permanent state of the religious community, that it had to be ongoing forever. And in this case, the innovation that David was unwilling to compromise about was what we might call non-adorationism. So David was convinced that that prayer could not be addressed to Jesus Christ. That prayer could only properly be addressed to God the Father. And he preached it, and he lifted that idea up. And Stephen Bathory accused him and found him guilty of innovation because of that. That wasn't the previous state of the Unitarian Church. That was something new. And that led to David Ferenc's imprisonment in the fortress in Deva, where he died of ill health in 1579. Now, it's important to add to the story that that an interesting chapter in David's imprisonment story was the intervention of a man named Faustus Socinus. Now, Faustus Socinus was an Italian Renaissance theologian, the son of a theologian who was not only familiar with Michael Servetus, but Socinus was an anti-Trinitarian himself. And when this controversy about innovation that would lead to the imprisonment of David Ferenc was happening, Giorgio Biandrata, who Roger introduced us to earlier, who had been the court physician for John Sigismund, pleaded with Faustus Socinus to come from Basel to Kolozsvár, to Transylvania, and convince David to stop all this innovation, to just settle, to end the controversy, to let things be for the sake of peace in the realm, to prevent further violence and conflict. Socinus did come. He lived with David, under David's roof for 4 months, and tried to convince him to just step away from this non-adorationist point of view and let things be. But he failed. David persisted in his resistance to authoritarianism, and as we have just discussed, lost his life in prison because of it. But the story continues, and Faustus Socinus, who had some connection with a anti-Trinitarian reform movement in Poland before coming to intervene in David's case, in 1579 returned to Poland and spent the last 25 years of his life there, not as a member of the reforming community there, which was known as the Minor Church or the Polish Brethren. He couldn't become a member of the Polish Brethren because Faustus Socinus also disagreed with the idea of baptism by water. And the Polish Brethren required that for membership, and so he never became a member. But he did marry a member of the Polish Brethren and really became a leading theologian, even somewhat from the outside of the Polish Brethren movement, to such an extent that the anti-Trinitarian, the Unitarian movement in Poland became associated with his name, and today that movement is typically referred to as Socinians. And that movement was organized around religious exploration, again, resistance to religious authority. They did a good deal of their resistance through printing. Here we come back to that new technology issue again. A press in Krakow was used to print anti-Trinitarian theological treatises that made their way all throughout Europe, including a masterpiece that's become known as the Rakovian Catechism, which outlined in great detail the theological foundations for the Unitarianism, the anti-Trinitarianism of the Polish Brethren that came to be known as Socinians. And I'll just share with you a couple of sentences from that, which point to the theological disagreement here. It says, on Christ the Savior, he writes that Jesus Christ is divine by office rather than by nature. This made the Rakovian Catechism a radical book for its time. He wrote that Christ is Savior not because he suffered for our sins, but because he showed us the way to eternal salvation, which consists in our imitating him, and that he did not suffer to satisfy God's justice, nor to appease his wrath. And really, you can just hear the beginnings, the stirrings of the New England Unitarianism, the Channing Unitarianism, which embraced this idea of imitating Jesus rather than recognizing a metaphysical shift that happened with Jesus's death in the Rakovian Catechism. But that's getting a little bit further ahead than we need to right away. I need to tell you or remind you that in the 1590s, these books from the Rakow Press were making their way to Holland and to England. In fact, in 1614, a Latin edition of the Rakovian Catechism was published and dedicated to King James I of England. Now, King James I of England wasn't very pleased about that. In the end, he required that all copies of the book be gathered and burned. But this is what the situation looks like in 1614. But in 1638, the authorities in Poland required that the press in Rakow be destroyed, and it was. And the Socinians that remained in Poland were expelled in 1668. Some of those Socinians went on to Prussia, where they founded some new congregations organized around Socinian thought. Others made their way to the Netherlands, where they experienced a degree of religious freedom in the later part of the 17th century, and were a part of transmitting those Socinian ideas across the Channel to English reformers. And others made their way to Transylvania, where Unitarianism, without innovation, was still a generally protected religious tradition. It wasn't an easy religion to follow. Oppression was real. It was hard to stand up tall in full strength in Transylvania as a Unitarian, though the courage of the leaders there was immense. And that congregation that transferred to Transylvania following the eviction of Torda was still in existence into the late 20th century. Moving back up to sort of more northern Europe, in 1645, we have one of the first pieces of evidence that Socinian ideas had made their way across the Channel to England, where John Biddle, who's often described as the father of British Unitarianism, was imprisoned for the first time, the first of perhaps a dozen times in Gloucester, because of his Unitarian and his Socinian views. And that's really a prelude to a new round of religious oppression in England. For example, in 1652, the English Parliament again made an order for all copies of the Rakovian Catechism to be seized and burned. But the stream of thought, just as it could not be ended with the Council of Nicaea, all those hundreds of years ago, continued to be a stream of thought in Transylvania, in places where the Socinians had found refuge after their expulsion from Poland, and indeed in England. We'd note that by 1774, Theophilus Lindsay, a successor to John Biddle, began conducting services as Unitarian church in London. Again in 1774, and we can look at that date as really the foundation of Unitarian churches in England. Now crossing the pond all the way to Boston in 1785, just 11 years later, James Freeman, who was the lay reader, the lay leader of King's Chapel in Boston. You see, when the American Revolution took place and King's Chapel no longer had an Anglican minister from the Church of England and requested one, the Church of England did not provide. So they looked to their lay reader, James Freeman, for leadership. And Freeman had been influenced by these same Socinian views that John Biddle and Theophilus Lindsay and many others had come across. Well, I think you know the story. He took the Book of Common Prayer in use at King's Chapel and made his Unitarian edits to the text there. King's Chapel became one of the first one of the first churches in the new United States that adopted a Unitarian theology, although remaining Anglican in liturgy and congregational in polity. So that was in 1785. Just a few years later, in 1794, Joseph Priestley, who was a Unitarian dissenting minister in England, and a supporter of Theophilus Lindsay, attended that same church in London that many American visitors, including Benjamin Franklin and others, also attended. Found it necessary to leave England for the United States. He and his wife, Mary Wilkinson, emigrated in 1794 to Philadelphia, and there they established the first formally named Unitarian church in America. And in that congregation, many of the political leaders of the United States found a spiritual home. In 1800, the ongoing reformation of what we might call generally Calvinist thought within the parish churches of New England was really taking place, a liberalizing reaction, a backlash to the Great Awakening, which was a movement of evangelical fervor in the end of the 18th century. A key marker is in 1800 when Reverend Buckminster settled at the Brattle Street Church in Boston and began preaching Unitarian ideas. This was symbolic of the fact that even central, powerful churches in the city of Boston could preach these reform ideas, these Unitarian theologies, and Buckminster was a real example of how that can happen. And then by 1805, things had really gone the way of the Unitarians when nothing less than Harvard Divinity School hired a Unitarian named Henry Ware as the Hollis Professor of Divinity. And this was the key educational moment for people in New England who were interested in becoming ministers. Now their key theological educator was no longer Orthodox, was no longer Trinitarian, and the institution that provided that training had really sided with the liberalizing tendency of the Unitarians, and many of the Orthodox decided the heck with this and moved on and started a school nearby and other schools of their own that would adopt an Orthodox theological education. The next really key marker here is in 1819 when Reverend William Ellery Channing, who we might describe as the minister of the city of Boston in so many ways. One of the really most powerful, well-respected voices among the clergy in Boston. Traveled to Baltimore, Maryland, at the ordination of Jared Sparks to deliver a sermon that was printed and perhaps one of the most widely read publications in the first 50 years of the United States, entitled Unitarian Christianity, really laying out the theology of the liberalizing clergy and congregations around Unitarian ideas. Now, I do need to say that that through this history that Roger and Sarah and I have been talking about, this chronology, we're really only telling one side of the family story here, the Unitarian side. The Universalist side of the family story is equally inspiring, equally important, but a little bit less related to the Edict of Torda. And so it's for that reason that we're focusing here and focusing on the Unitarian side of the family here. With that, I guess I just want to say that that the Edict of Torda really was a key marker, a turning point, the beginning of something, not an end in any way, but a shift, an inspirational shift. As you can tell from the histories that we've shared, there have been many other important turnings in this year, but they all seem to point either forward to or back to this key moment 450 years ago, the Edict of Torda. And we really recommend to you a chance to see that formative moment as a basic turning point toward who we have been and even who we are today. So with that, let me turn back to Roger and Sarah and see if there are pieces of the chronology or the relevance of the Edict of Torda that we want to point back to or didn't get around to sharing. What do you think, Roger and Sarah? How are we doing?
I think we covered it. A very cursory view of it, but.
And the only thing I would add is there are non-Western pockets of Unitarianism that show up around the world, Rupaya and Eric and Roger, correct me if I'm mistaken, but I believe the Chennai Christian Unitarian Church was actually founded in 1795. So we tell that there's a good documentation of, Unitarianism sort of really growing out of the Transylvanian region of what was Hungary at the time and now is currently modern day Romania, and its movement west. But there are Unitarian theological conversations and texts and ideas that show up that do show up elsewhere in the world over the course of this history. So we could continue the webinar for the next 6 hours and we wouldn't cover all those places, but this is just the beginning, and we would encourage you to do some investigating of where other Unitarian thought was emerging, not just in the movement west, but in other places, because there were simultaneous thinking and rethinking about the Trinity and about religious freedom and what does that really mean. So this was not a Western, a European unique thing. It was that this is well documented and a well-known piece of our history, of our human history, but it's certainly not the whole picture. So that would be the only piece I would fill in.
That's really helpful, Sarah, and also that we're ending this description of the history very early in the formation of Unitarian Universalism by by stopping at 1819. And that's really so that this webinar can look at foundations rather than to be, a kind of a complete overview of the path of Unitarianism and Unitarian Universalism around the world. So at that point, let me just say thanks to all of you who joined us for the call today. And Roger and Sarah, it's such a pleasure to be seated around this virtual table with the two of you, and Ellen and Rupaya and Stephanie and Norbert and Fulgence. It will be an even greater pleasure to be in the audience and listening to the theological dialogue that you have in store for Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists over the next year. Thanks, everyone.